All right, it's the top of the hour, so good morning or afternoon, depending where you are. And welcome to our fourth round of the U.S. Department of Education's webinar series on blending and braiding. I'm Stephen Costio, and I will once again be your guide as we navigate a new topic, engaging the philanthropic community as a catalyst for scaling up place-based whole child partnerships. We're going to start today with some opening remarks from Eddie Cohen at the Institute for Educational Leadership, turn to a moderated panel with philanthropic leaders, and wrap up by taking questions from you all before wrapping up to close out close to the top of the hour. Once again, this webinar will be recorded and shared with all of you tuning in and everybody who's registered, along with the slide deck. And we've sent the recordings to the previous webinars to the over 1,300 folks who have registered for this series. We're also working on getting the whole series on the U.S. Department of Education's YouTube page and our Promise Neighborhood website, where over 800 people have already viewed the first recording, and we've got the second one up there now. We continue to encourage you to share your questions using the Zoom chat and Q&A features. We're going to answer as many questions as we can during today's webinar, and we will provide each speaker's email at the end so you can follow up with any additional questions that you have. Our last webinar looked at different strategies to coordinate funding, most prominently children's cabinets and county-level partnerships. We had experts provide best practices for blending and braiding funds, and several nonprofit and local government leaders shared how their programs contribute to a cohesive whole child vision. Today, we're going to turn to the role of the philanthropic community and specifically what they do to convene, align, evaluate, and bolster other state, federal, and local investments. And to kick us off, I'm excited to turn it over to someone who's been a leader of leaders. Eddie Cohen has been leading place-based partnerships across the nation, including at the Urban League in Southwest Ohio and at the United Way in Colorado. I've been lucky enough to go through the Education Policy Fellowship Program at the Institute for Educational Leadership. So I've gotten a little taste of the great work that he now leads at IEL, and I'm really pleased to welcome the president of the Institute for Educational Leadership, Eddie Cohen.
Thanks so much, Stephen, and good afternoon to everyone. We'll talk a little bit about IEL, the Institute for Educational Leadership, and our partnership with philanthropic organizations. So for those who don't know about us, the Institute for Educational Leadership is a group of talented and dedicated practitioners who change systems by developing people within those systems. So we are a national nonprofit that develops and connects adults and youth leaders who strengthen communities and education systems to lift the community. So I like to say we're a 60-year strong organization led by an amazing board and staff that brings both lived experiences and cross-sector leadership to inform our practice. To create community-driven solutions, we partner with schools, with districts, with higher education, community-based organizations, intermediaries, funders, and government agencies too. So we believe that leadership development, stakeholder coordination, and design are key to drive change for children, youth, and families. We listen to our communities, and together we co-design lasting solutions. So our frameworks, like our Building Community School Systems Guide, have been used in the field to scale and deepen collaborative leadership practices across the country. And recently, our movement building work with field ambassadors, it builds both local capacity and draws on the expertise of cross-sectoral leaders to accelerate impact in communities across the country. So through partnership with philanthropy, we've built and continue to build a movement. We build movements through our networks, which have over 15,000 educators and community members, and create, I would say, inclusive spaces for practitioners, researchers, and advocates to come together to learn, to share, and to drive change. So many of you on this webinar have been part of our coalition networks. And of course, shameless plug, we welcome you to join us and 5,000 educators in Minneapolis in May for our annual National Community Schools and Family Engagement Conference. We started out as an organization to help people learn about federal policies. We are advocates, so we listen to the communities we serve and co-create each congressional session a policy by the people agenda. And that really drives our collective efforts to sustain community schools, our family engagement work, place-based work, and whole child initiatives across the country. And of course, we invite you to join in March for our Washington Policy Seminar. It's a place where we have folks from across the country strategize, organize, and build coalition for the new year. So philanthropic partnerships are key for all of our work, in particular for community schools and our whole child work. Can't really understate really the role of funders, how they serve to incubate and help innovation, new trends and approaches, as well as deepening and scaling practices in places and regions. So nonprofits and intermediaries like us wouldn't exist without private funding support, because funders have really understood that driving deep change requires building the capacity of adults to do better by children. So the very genesis of the Coalition of Community Schools in 1997 and IEL, which houses the coalition 60 years ago, started because of the benevolence of funders who believed in the vision. Now, interestingly, they had no real proof points. There was no formulaic model or thoughts about best practices or how do you scale for impact, but it was deeply rooted in trust. This entire organization started by understanding the limitations of programmatic improvements and the need to expose leaders to policy 60 years ago. So the Ford Foundation planted a seed gift that would last 60 years later. And in 1997, when the Coalition for Community Schools was started and housed at IEL in partnership with University of Pennsylvania, Netter Center, and Children's Aid, it was done through radical trust. There was amazing and related adjacent movements that I have to mention that occurred slightly before or after that founding, including the Beacon Schools in New York and later what would become known as the Harlem Children's Zone, leading to the incredible work today at Julius Wilson Institute. So many of these movements were started through small donations first of time, talent, treasure, and later testimony that was shared and were empowered, and philanthropy served as a catalyst, right? One small gift to us from Mott in 1997 by Jane Quinn would lead to our community schools and family engagement work. Last year, our convenings reached over 180 school districts, 8,000 schools, and represented over 5 million students. Through that initial gift, there was a recognition that if we want to change organizations, we need to help co-create systems driven by community to change the behaviors and practices, right? Philanthropy, I think, creates the space for collaboration, for professional development, technical assistance, and community building. We all know on this call that investments are essential. We need frameworks, tools, structures. They, I think, collectively are significant to shift policy and practice. So in our own work, Annie Casey, they partnered with us to design our youth voice and community school guides and the protocols that are now being used across the country. Investments in our regional work from funders like the National Education Association Foundation have created really a collaborative working model for us to work together in the Southeast, which is massively underinvested in. The Balmer Group seeding funds for us and partners to improve upon the existing community school pillars to really drive, I think, a greater sense of belonging that will ultimately lead to better social and academic outcomes. Kresge has been persistent in place-based work. And then we also work with the NBA Foundation, and they invest in our RAMP program, which has provided hundreds of youth living with disabilities access to leadership, to career-focused mentoring and workforce development. So as the new Congress and administration, which is all on our minds, takes office next month, we are on the eve, I think, of a significant change at the federal level and the national and state landscape. And I think we all know and realize the inflection point that we're in for education. And philanthropy has to double down on community schools, on strategies, on place-based work, and critical whole child initiatives, even in their adaptation of language. We must engage, I think, in trust-based philanthropy and organizations that are at the forefront of these community-driven solutions and change, both legacy and new organizations. We need to support the regional, the national, and the local intermediaries who build the capacity of our districts and community organizations, because agility and adaptability will be key. So in many ways, I think we all on this call need to weaponize our own status, whether it is our personal or institutional privilege, to assist those who are most vulnerable. We have to be adaptable, but not assimilate our values. To navigate in spaces where people we serve may not be able to be present, we need philanthropy not only to invest, I think, but to commit to rapidly invest in its values. And the historicity of movements we know and philanthropy are really inextricable. If we think about the American Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement, philanthropy, time, talent, treasure, and testimony has played a critical role in shaping that history, often open and when necessary, being more methodical. They've supported work that would later help rebuild and share the identity, I think, in this nation. So thank you for just indulging me in this moment, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the panel.
Yeah, I really appreciate you joining us, Eddie, and sharing some of that context. I think it's really important what you shared to emphasize some of the things we've already heard in this series about building capacity, building those partnerships, and sharing the story of actual examples of, the seed funding and what that looks like, 20, 30, 60 years later. And I'm excited to build on what you've shared by bringing in some other folks to give us a little bit more context and stories here. So I'm going to once again share my screen and introduce a few folks to the panel here. To give us a more in-depth view of what philanthropic leaders do. We've invited some of them here and how they jumpstart and sustain promising programs, as Eddie mentioned. I have the honor of welcoming these following folks to our webinar series. Each one has braided funding and brought in partners to align efforts in impressive and impactful ways. We have Tracy Brody, the Senior Associate and Overseer of National Community Strategies at the Annie Casey Foundation, where she leads community and youth engagement with a focus on ensuring young people impacted by policy and investments are meaningfully engaged in program development, implementation, and evaluation. And Jonathan Hui, who's the Senior Program Officer at the Kresge Foundation, where he supports efforts across the foundation, including early childhood education, neighborhood development, and bringing together leaders across multiple sectors. Work that some of us at the department were able to see up close over the summer at the Marygrove Cradle-to-Career campus, which is located outside of Detroit. And we also have Peter Ross, the managing director of the Youth Thriving Through Leadership, Youth Thriving Through Learning Fund at the Stewart Foundation. And I've been lucky to know Peter for a few years and really appreciate his ability to incorporate what we know to be true on the research side and bring that into the policy implementation and practice parts of whole child initiatives. Something that he's done at Education First in the consulting world and at the Learning Policy Institute in the think tank space for school districts and now at Stewart. And so now that we've got the introductions, I want to jump into our first question just to get a lay of the land and hear from each of your vantage points. Can you share with us a little bit more about your organization and how you all approach blending and braiding? And we can start with Tracy, then move to Jonathan and wrap up with Peter.
Good afternoon, everyone. And Stephen, thank you for inviting me to contribute to today's conversation. I'm Tracy Brody, a Senior Program Officer at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. At the Annie E. Casey Foundation, we're a private philanthropy that builds a brighter future for the nation's children and youth. And at the foundation, we really want to work to make sure that all young people have the family connections, the relationships, the communities, and educational employment opportunities that they need to thrive. And we concentrate on young people and families with the greatest needs, including young people that have low incomes, live in high poverty communities, and could be involved in the juvenile justice system or child welfare systems. And so as a program officer focused on our community change initiatives, my approach to both braiding and blending funding is best illustrated in how I strive to show up as a funder and as a program officer. Within our community leadership and engagement portfolio, we invest in local communities with a strategic co-investor approach, which is a role that gives us a seat at the table, but also enables our community partners to really lead and drive those key decision-making processes. So we also have a focus on place-based initiatives and working with different communities, and each one of those having different systems, stakeholders, organizations at the table has really allowed the foundation to learn, adapt to different types of program and partnership models with different leadership styles and neighborhood contexts. And in order to do that, we have to recognize that we are only one entity and we cannot be everything to everyone. And so we really strive to work in concert, not only with our community partners, but also systems leaders and peer funders to be experts in things that we are not. And by coming alongside and strategically weaving ourselves and our influence into community change efforts, we're relying on the expertise, the vision, the commitment of like-minded folks that are working together to move the needle for young people across the country.
Yeah, Jonathan, the same question to you.
Absolutely. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jonathan Hoy. I lead our children and families work at the Detroit program at the Kresge Foundation. Our work in Detroit is our signature place-based work here at the Kresge Foundation. Even though we're national, we have deep place-based work in a few communities, including our hometown in Detroit. And why I highlight our place-based work, I think that is where for Kresge, where our blending and braiding work, I think, comes into greatest focus. I think is our belief that when you land resources in place, I think to Tracy's point about context too, when you land resources in place, you have to really take into account the context of place, the resources that already exist in place, the assets in place, the history of place, and how you can ensure that public resources, when they land in place, honor that existing context. And I think that's where philanthropy can play a role, right? That federal resources are meant to be applied across the country in rural contexts, in urban contexts, in suburban contexts. But what philanthropy, working alongside place-based community organizations, can do is to ensure that the ways in which those federal funds are applied makes sense for us, for a given community. And I think that's why for us, policy implementation is a really important goal. Is policy advocacy is important because we're advocating for what a community wants to see in terms of policy. But after dollars are appropriated, we also have to make sure that once dollars land in place, that they meet the needs of the children and families that live in that place. So, for example, how do we make sure that federal dollars don't have unintended consequences, right? How do we ensure that the implementation of federal dollars really fully address the priorities that came out in the NOFO, right? To ensure that community-based organizations, some of these are smaller organizations led by people of color, led by resident leaders, have access to those public funds. How do we ensure that the voices of young people and of educators and of families get to inform where these dollars might be subgranted, right? There are a lot of decisions that happen after grant awards that really requires a deeply place-based local infrastructure to implement them, to make sure that how dollars are spent are accountable to the community, are equitable, are values aligned. And I think that's where philanthropy alongside place-based community organizations can play a role.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Peter, I'll send the same question your way.
Great. Thanks for having us, Stephen. And good morning, actually, from the West Coast, those of you listening on the West Coast. I'm with the Stewart Foundation, and we have a new initiative that we have just undertaken that is explicitly all about blending and braiding. So happy to be on this particular panel. As Stephen mentioned earlier, it's called the Youth Thriving Through Learning Fund. And it is a collaborative effort of now 10 funders and growing. I'll drop in the link. It doesn't have all 10 listed because we just got a couple new partners. And what we're trying to do here in California is to build on the terrific federal investments in community schools and other high school related endeavors to support California's major public investments, over $5 billion in community schools, in Golden State Pathways, and in dual enrollment, to support the field in using those dollars effectively, to also do research that will allow for us to be learning from this, and to then share the stories that will help with future policy and funding downstream. The braiding and blending comes from understanding that each of these different initiatives, while all related to secondary and pathways into post-secondary education, we want to be careful that they're not siloed. We want to reinforce the good work within each of them and elevate a larger agenda around transforming California's comprehensive high schools into dynamic, personalized, engaged learning places. And we want to make sure that folks that are using dollars such as community schools, whether they're federal or California state dollars, also are aware of and have the know-how and support to braid those with dollars for, say, expanded learning or dollars here on mental health and other related dollars. So very excited to be here, and I'll turn it back to you, Stephen.
Yeah, well, thank you all. And I'm already seeing some themes here from what you all shared in your organizations and what Eddie shared at the beginning of amplifying a lot of what's already going on in communities. And you all have already touched on some of the themes we've heard throughout this series on building the capacity of local leaders, working towards community co-created visions, facilitating partnerships, including with youth and incorporating youth voice, and providing that kind of logistical knowledge and coordination of the different funding streams. And Jonathan, I want to go back to you because I know you've partnered with leaders across many federal agencies that you alluded to in the opening that provide services and programs, especially in Detroit. And I was curious if you could give us some additional examples of how you got those folks, together and what you've learned from those interactions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one really important first step as we think about blending and braiding even comes before applications for federal funding. And I think, that's why having partnerships, and I think that a unique opportunity for funders that are on this webinar is, private foundations are not eligible for federal funding. I think that means that private foundations have an ability to, I think, partner with federal agencies in a way that does not pose a conflict of interest, right, of who might be applying for funding. And I think the opportunity really is around a shared visioning and collective problem solving that can really be deeply rooted in place, working alongside multiple federal agencies to think about how funding from different agencies can come together to blend and braid, right, to address a specific issue. And so in Detroit, we have worked with the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agency in the past to address issues related to child health that came out of freight transportation, right? Like very disparate things, right? Child health, transportation, seemingly very disparate, but it is actually fundamentally an educational issue, right? Like child asthma, road safety lead to increased levels of chronic absenteeism. And so having different agencies come together and actually sit with community for a day or two, listening to community leaders who are saying, this is our everyday experience. These are the challenges we're experiencing every single day, is very helpful, because I think what agencies can then do is to say, well, we know that these, we're hearing these are some of the challenges you're lifting up. These are some of the grant programs, the discretionary grant programs that are available through DOT or EPA or ED or HHS or HUD. And also, these are the formula grant opportunities that, the agencies might have issued guidance that allows for flexibilities for formula funds to be used different ways. So it's not just limited to discretionary funding. It's both discretionary and formula funding. But I think the important opportunity is for that open dialogue and shared visioning and shared collective problem solving, that the relationship with our agencies is not just transactional. And I think I really applaud the administration for focusing on that, right? It's like, it's not just you apply for a grant, you don't get it, or you get it and then you sign a grant agreement and you move on. There's a genuine dialogue and an openness to hear, these are some of the challenges we're experiencing in community. And from our federal partners, these are some of the solutions that we can offer up based on guidance, based on allowability, based on discretionary grants that are open. And this is how transportation funding can tackle this. This is how education funding can tackle this. This is how environmental protection money can tackle this. And I think when those funds come together, you can then really envision how all of these different silos, all of these different sectors can actually come together to address a common issue faced by students and families. And so I think that's a really important step in blending and braiding. It's before the dollars actually come, identifying where are the dollars, what are the dollars that can be used to address the different needs that all might come down to one issue, right? All of this might relate to chronic absence, but you need transportation, you need housing, you need food, all of these different things to kind of address the one issue. And I think, philanthropy can play a really important role in the convening and connecting the dots to have some of these conversations between community leaders and our federal partners.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up the common data point around chronic absenteeism. That's something we've been hearing throughout this series, is that's often, coordinating around data and understanding what issues communities want to address has been a key part of whether we were talking between agency partners or, local leaders implementing grant programs. That's come up throughout this series. And you also mentioned that shared visioning and the collective problem solving piece, which makes me think of the work that you're doing, Peter, at the Stewart Foundation, helping to bring together the multiple funders to support common goals, that reinforce, as you mentioned, those federal and state investments, and including California's investments in mental health and community schools. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about that work and how you see your role in convening those multiple partners, especially to fill information and implementation gaps.
Yeah, happy to. It really builds on what Jonathan was actually talking about, the way that philanthropy can both shed a light on opportunity and also on challenges, and then create the space for folks to come together. So we're still very much in early days with this new Youth Thriving Through Learning Fund. But one example of something we've already started to do is there's a set of technical assistance partners that are working with the state of California to implement the funds that I mentioned earlier. So that includes folks like the UCLA Center for Community Schooling and the Community Schools Learning Exchange that are working significantly on community schools here in California. The Linked Learning Alliance doing related work on pathways in our Golden State Pathways program, and the Career Ladders Project that's playing a pivotal role both with pathways but also with the dual enrollment work that we're doing here. One of the things that we're doing is trying to bridge the gap between federal dollars, state dollars, way up here at a high altitude with what's actually going on the ground in classrooms, schools, districts, and communities on the ground. And these partners, along with others like the Learning Policy Institute, which now has a new Center for School and System Redesign, or other partner, Education Trust West, that's helping kind of bring together and help folks understand and mediate the policy landscape here in California. What we're doing is bringing them together to identify what Jonathan was talking about. what are the opportunities here? Where are ways that philanthropy could grease the skids and make it a little bit easier for those dollars to flow in an efficient, productive way into communities and be used in wonderful ways, and to identify challenges within the different strands of work. And then also elevate it to a conversation where this is all about all of California's children and California's educators and our public education system. So what can we be learning from what's happening from community schools that might inform a pathways effort, or similarly might inform a dual enrollment effort? So our role is both to bring folks together, to allow them to have the space and the time to be learning from one another, and to make sure that that then gets pushed out back to schools and districts and county offices across the state.
Yeah, and I think you kind of answered one of the questions that's in the chat now. I'm hearing that philanthropy can, in the meetings you're having with federal, state, local TA partners, you're hearing concerns from all of those different sides. And I think we've heard a lot about breaking down silos throughout this series. And I'm hearing that you can kind of bring together folks of, we heard this from one partner and we want to bring it to your attention and have a discussion about an issue. Maybe it's around chronic absence, maybe it's around flexibilities in a grant program. But I think that's a great way to get people to understand they might be working on a similar issue who don't originally see that. And Tracy, I want to move to you next, because I think one of the exciting parts of your work is and your portfolio, and Eddie mentioned a little bit of it at the beginning, is youth engagement. And I'm wondering if you can share more about how you involve youth as co-designers and decision makers, especially when it comes to creating programs. And we don't always think about them when we think about funding decisions, but how do you make that jump of including them in the impact decisions?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I've been deeply entrenched in youth engagement since I started my nonprofit career. And now I'm really just really fortunate to lead some really great work here at Casey. Stephen, the first thing that comes to mind is how important it is for us to expand the conversation beyond youth engagement. And what I mean by that is that it is very, very rare where when we are just engaging young people in silo. What we really are talking about is intergenerational engagement, and even more tricky, engaging young people with systems leaders at a shared table. I am fortunate to be concluding a second year of both leading and facilitating an intergenerational collaborative at the foundation, where we are working with several different organizations. The collaborative itself is made up of organizations that are working on community change initiatives that involve diverse stakeholders. So they have systems leaders at the table, they have government agencies at the table, they have residents, they have young people, and they are trying to move the needle towards not complete sometimes youth adult equity, but young people being involved in, just like you said, like meaningful decision making on things that matter to them. And so while we are still working on our final project, which is an intergenerational toolkit to support organizations, systems, and communities that are looking to strengthen those youth adult partnerships, I can tell you that we've already yielded some really important insights on how young people and adults can work better together. And so I'll share just a few of them, and I'll also drop in the chat some links to learn more about how we're doing this work here at Casey. And so one of the things which sounds as someone who has been in youth engagement, like second nature to me, but is not second nature to a lot of folks, is just like stopping and listening. Adult leaders have to do some internal work in dispelling negative stereotypes and false narratives around young people, particularly young people from marginalized communities. And so not just listening, but also being willing to step aside when necessary to elevate young people's voices so that they can be heard over some of the noise that we hear in the community. Another piece to that is also empowering young people and adults should view listening to young people as essential to understanding their needs, but also in making those informed decisions. And it is really hard to share power with someone who you do not deem to be powerful. And so identifying that young people have power and they have things that to share that not only should be taken into consideration, but can be driving forces in the solutions development process. And that is very nice to say. But the third thing that we know is that in doing that work, we have to center the training and support for both youth and adult partners. Expanding the capacity for youth and adults to partner together requires a tremendous amount of support and resources and training in areas like race equity, skill development, research evaluation. This isn't something that's plug and play where you can just press go on youth engagement. There has to be a strategy. There has to be readiness to integrate youth voice and youth needs into the solutions development process into final products. And also, I think, how to utilize government partners. Youth adult partnerships have to also be thinking about how they can work with local lawmakers and government officials to improve strategy and program design. And a lot of times those systems just aren't built to integrate young people in that way. I mean, I don't know the last time that I was able to involve a young person in a meeting that was at 11:30 in the morning, right? And that's where most of these conversations are happening. And so it does require a great deal of training and a great deal of preparation. But when it's done and done well, it can be truly transformational in the process. And so soon come in terms of like final lessons learned and our toolkit. But right now I'll drop in the chat some more information so folks can have a better sense of how we are tackling it as a foundation.
Yeah, and I agree with the program design piece that you mentioned. We're lucky enough to have youth reviewers for the most recent round of Promise Neighborhood grants here, and they provided some really unique insights of having, somebody who's going to be impacted by these funds, looking at how they could be used. And I think, there is, to your point, building their capacity of what does policy look like? How do we, get them comfortable with those formats of policy? But once that, you do, and we've been lucky to work through our youth engagement office at the department to do some of that work. And the other thing you mentioned that really resonated with me was those place-based whole child partnerships as intergenerational. And I can't tell you the number of folks who we have as grantees who's, they might have been moms who had children in a Head Start program, or they started out as a coordinator, and then they go on to lead that program, or their child goes on to be a part of that program as well. And those are stories that, folks often share with us as how this work is place-based and really meaningful to them. We've got a question in the chat, and this one I think Peter relates to something I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned that the philanthropic investments, it's not a one-time deal. It's an ongoing conversation and consideration, and you and the Stewart Foundation in particular have been intentional about engaging with researchers, as you mentioned, on the evaluation side to study the impact of your work. So I'm wondering if you can share how you've been able to engage some of the partners you mentioned, like the UCLA Learning Policy Institute, to inform future investments by both philanthropic and government leaders.
Well, I do think it's a unique role that philanthropy can play. The dollars in many of these public initiatives, rightfully, are intended to actually change practice in schools and in communities. And that, for good or bad, leaves a void in trying to really understand what's truly going on and what's been effective. And so one of the things our collaborative fund is taking on is commissioning a set of studies to understand what is really working in California around community schools, around pathways, around dual enrollment, and doing it in a way where we make sure we're understanding the impact at multiple levels of the system. What does it mean for students and their families? What does it mean for educators? What does it mean for school leaders, system leaders? And then ultimately, how does that all roll up into evidence that can inform future federal and state policy? And critically, we need to do that in a way that reflects the diversity that is California. So California is a highly diverse state. It is a deeply rural and suburban and urban state. And it is deeply diverse on a number of different dimensions. One that's top of mind for us these days is that 1 in 5 children in California's public school systems are multilingual learners. So as we think about implementing community schools and pathways and dual enrollment, what does that mean for our multilingual learner population? How are we taking the assets of their multilingualism and blending that with new and better ways to do secondary education, for instance? So we're excited to commission a set of studies, but then critically related to that, Stephen, we want to also just be telling the stories. So some narrative work that makes it more accessible than just research studies that are going to go to a certain set of scholars. We're less interested in that and much more interested in what will inform the general public and what will inform policymakers, and of course, what will inform families, students, and educators.
Well, I appreciate that, Peter. And I think throughout this series, we've gotten questions of what does this look like? Is this, what is it? We know what it looks like in theory, but how do you do it? And I think those case studies play a really important role in answering those questions. And we have a question in the chat that relates to something I wanted to ask you, Jonathan. The question in the chat is, what advice do you have for those in the work, especially in community school work, to start and lead these shared visioning and funding conversations? And I know you've been really intentional about building the capacity of others in your community to open lines of communication, to facilitate exchanges of best practices. And so I'm wondering how you've done that and how we can build more public-private partnerships like the ones you've developed at Kresge.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to that point, Stephen, I might maybe lift up 2 different examples of public-private partnerships that I think live in 2 different ends of the spectrum along kind of when federal funds come into communities. I think one is around how funds are blended and braided at the kind of application stage or when the funds are received. And I think that really, provides an opportunity for that local place-based infrastructure that can receive dollars, that can hold applications, right? Oftentimes, these are city and state government agencies, which are great. I think they do amazing work and they often help communities access public dollars. But I think there are also nonprofit organizations that are positioned to help communities blend and braid federal dollars. I mean, you think of community development financial institutions, right? CDFIs, these are nonprofit financial institutions that play a really important role in many communities to provide kind of different sources of capital into communities. And they can often blend tax credits, right? They can help navigate new markets tax credits and historic tax credits. They can help navigate community development block grant money. And for those that are in the education world in the room, like these are sources of funds and tax credits that are not usually accessed by education entities, right? Like community schools require facilities. School facilities require renovations. How do we access HUD dollars? How do we access tax credits to upgrade these facilities to kind of blend and braid the physical infrastructure side of the house and also with programmatic dollars? CDFIs can do a lot of that work, and I think for funders in the room, like really understanding how to partner with CDFIs, I think can really provide that opportunity to blend and braid in ways that really meet the needs of communities and community organizations. Oftentimes, these nonprofit intermediaries are those that are most proximate, have really great relationships with place-based organizations in some ways that maybe state agencies might not, right? Like these are organizations that have worked deeply in place. And so I think there is an opportunity to really leverage the nonprofit infrastructure. On the other end of the spectrum is around how to blend and braid resources and kind of access to programs, for example. So, once federal dollars flow into communities, how do residents, families, children actually access these programs? I think that's where place-based organizations come into play, right? These are organizations, community development organizations. These are organizations that have worked deeply in community, led by resident leaders, right? That like can be trusted messengers, can play that navigation role for families to access. For this, you have to go talk to Health and Human Services. For this, you have to talk to education. For this, you have to talk to housing, right? So these place-based organizations are really important in playing that role. And I think to answer the Q&A question then is making the case to funders, right? That like supporting the visioning process, supporting place-based organizations as these trusted messengers, as the glue, the amount of resources needed to support deeply place-based organizations to help residents get access to public resources is a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of federal resources that are coming to ground, right? Like a $20-30 million federal grant can be really impactful in community if you make a $25,000, $50,000 grant to a community organization who can help residents navigate an online platform, right? Like we knew this from the expanded child tax credit, where the expanded child tax credit was a once-in-a-generation opportunity, but it required income tax preparers to go door to door to find families who might not have filed taxes, right? Like that's the kind of infrastructure. It's a $25,000, $50,000 investment that can unlock millions of dollars of federal funds. And I think that's the case for funders, right? Is funders love leverage. And so making a smaller grant to a local organization to unlock these public dollars, I think that's a return on investment case that can be made to philanthropy.
Yeah, that navigation role I think is so important, and we've heard about it to some extent in this series around like a community school coordinator who can help students who need access to healthcare, dental care, housing, connect with those resources. Getting that logistical knowledge through a backbone organization and the role that they can play to bolster community leaders who are already working, every hour of the day. So providing that technical know-how, that physical and policy translation is really important. And Tracy, I want to turn to you next because I know the national community strategies you lead at the Annie E. Casey Foundation focuses in part on building community leadership, and I think we've heard a lot about that here. And curious about what you've learned from that part of your portfolio and how that can help more local leaders bring together multiple people, multiple funding sources for a common purpose.
Yeah, again, excellent question. And I couldn't have answered it better than what Jonathan did. So I was like, oh shoot, he took all my points. So I'll pivot a little bit and say this. So one of the NCS initiatives that has taught us a lot about what it takes for local coalitions to bring together funding for a shared vision or goal is called Evidence of Success. And most of our learning stem from our implementation of that framework. And the framework includes coalition building, centering youth voice with data and evaluation practices, but also fund mapping and strategic financing tools that help community coalitions identify and coordinate local, state, and national funding sources that they then will invest in programs that respond to the outcomes that are important to them. And so knowing the landscape is really, really important, but fund mapping does not stand alone. It's part of a broader approach to developing what I think is super, super important, and that is a collaborative, like strategic financing plan. So the strategic financing plan process that we, to Jonathan's point, have invested in for years that helps organizations to unlock these like bigger grant dollars involves a comprehensive approach to managing financial resources that effectively support the coalition's shared purpose. And so that 5-step process guides our grantee partners through to develop answers to core questions. So those core questions are, like, what are your finance goals? Being able to identify as a group priority programs and needs that are going to support the infrastructure that they need. Also, what financial resources do they need to be able to implement those programs and those goals? So being able to estimate costs and how for implementing the programs and also to support the infrastructure, what resources do they have? So that's that landscape analysis and fund mapping process. And then also what strategic financing strategies are they going to implement? So working together as a coalition to identify financing strategies that are going to support implementation. And then lastly, how are they going to implement those strategies? So that's where local leaders would come together to develop a work plan. And one of the key takeaways from our grantees who have gone through this process is grounded in the framing of your question, Stephen. And that is like that common purpose in what we call here, like the shared why. Without that commitment and without that clarity, bringing multiple funders to the table can be really, really difficult. There's also a lot of learning around cross-sectional partnerships and the importance in those partnerships of having formalized MOUs and funding agreements. Those formal partnerships often provide the capacity and infrastructure for both predictable and sustainable implementation. Things like keeping data in the forefront and being able to demonstrate impact and the ability to both track and report multiple outcomes across several different entities. But more essential to all of those things has been the intentional relationship building that you have to do within these coalitions that's aimed at both developing and deepening trust. When there are multiple partners that are attempting to bring in multiple funding resources, local leaders are often relying on relationships that they've spent years cultivating. So braiding and blending on the coalition level also often means opening up those relationships to lesser known entities and often perceived competitors, all for this shared why. And that why and that trust within partnerships has to be strong enough to withstand the inevitable challenges that arise. And so that investment from philanthropy, to Jonathan's point, that $25,000 to $50,000 investment on our end, and that local leadership's shared commitment and helping them go through the process by which they can sustain that coalition and the programs and the priorities that mean the most to their community change initiatives is so very, very important.
Yeah, and you brought up two things that we've heard at, I know in the first webinar, a speaker shared, fund your plan of, having that shared why is really important at the beginning, and then be realistic about costs. You can want everything to happen in a community, but if you're not realistic about that and using some tools like the ones you shared, or we had the Children's Funding Project to present some of their fiscal mapping tools, it's really important to have those frameworks to be able to work within. And just looking at the chat here, and I think we've gotten to pretty much all of the questions here. One that I've heard both in the chat here and from other folks is, if you're not working with philanthropy, if you don't see the partners coming together, like, what's a first step? How do you get involved with that? And Peter, I might turn this to you, because I know you've shared a little bit of like finding out what partners philanthropic groups are working with is one way to do it, but curious if there might be other ways that folks can kind of get a foot in the door as to working with philanthropic partners.
I think it's important, and this is challenging, but a lot of what we've talked about today is in many ways abstract. because we're talking about policy and we're talking about the levers of philanthropy, et cetera. But I think the way to truly get traction is to be able to tell the story. So what is the story of the work in your community? If you can succinctly and powerfully tell that, and in particular, tell that alongside, as Tracy, I think, was getting to, alongside other members of the community and alongside other allied organizations within your community, that will be powerful to local philanthropic entities. So I think trying to articulate, for instance, if you're doing a community school, what is the point of doing it? And where are you trying to move your community and the education setting within your community through that? And who are you partnering with, and what is the potential impact of all of that? Being able to tell that story and then do it through the voices of both students and families and educators, but also the leaders of community organizations that are working on the ground. I think that's the way to kind of begin to have dialogue with the local philanthropic community in your area.
Yeah, and I know Stuart has storytellers, people who are, dedicated to doing that, which is a really cool role to play. Tracy, Jonathan, anything to add to that of how to engage with philanthropic partners?
I was just going to say, I think that Peter hit the nail on the head as far as like making sure that you can tell the story and not just like the output data story, but like the process data as well. Like, what does it take? And being honest about that. I think a lot of times we ask for I think Eddie said it earlier, that this is the time for trust-based philanthropy. And like that trust is built on a transparent relationship. So yeah.
And Jonathan will give you a last word here before we close out. Any last thoughts on that?
No, I think it's as we think about blending and braiding, it's just I think it's really emphasizing that, like, without really deep knowledge of the place that the dollars are going to, it won't succeed. I think that's part of the storytelling. I think that's part of the storytelling that both Peter and Tracy are talking about, is like, we need partners in place to ensure that dollars are going to kids and families. And I think it's telling the story of like why the resident leaders that have done this for generations, maybe for free, why a little bit of resourcing might help take, tenfold the impact that they've already been having. I think that's part of that story.
Well, thank you all for telling your stories to this audience today. This has been a really great conversation. We're coming towards the top of the hour here, so I'm kind of sad to close it out, but I know you all will be getting questions after this webinar as well. And folks have been really interested in resources, so I'm glad that Tracy shared some of those in the chat and appreciated some of the resources that we had some of our participants in this webinar share as well. And so we'll include this in the slides, some of those strategic financing tools, again, that Tracy mentioned. This concludes our fourth out of 5 webinars in this series. We hope you join our final webinar next year that's listed on this screen and included in the Zoom events registration page. Our final webinar is going to be on January 16th, and it's going to focus on the role of nonprofits in blending and braiding funds. And finally here, if we did not get to your question, I think we did get to them all, but if you are interested in asking additional questions or you want to follow up with one of our speakers, I encourage you to reach out to them using the contact information listed on this slide. I also just want to appreciate all of you who have shared your own examples, your own stories, your own resources. So please keep in touch, keep those coming. They've helped made this series all the better. And so on behalf of the Department of Education, our speakers today, thank you for joining us. Have a happy holiday season and see you next year. Bye-bye.